You're not after the bubbles of bliss that Dostoevsky described in Notes from Underground. We're built to contend with the world. We're built to contend with reality. You want a challenge, and the best way that you can take on a challenge, because a challenge fortifies you. So you don't want to be secure, you want to be strong. And you get strong by taking on optimal challenges. And so you lay out your destiny in the world, and you take the slings and arrows of fate, and you make yourself stronger while you're doing so. And you might fail, and fortune might do you in, but it's your best bet. And people have extracted unbelievable successes out of catastrophic failures. And I'm not saying that in a naive way. I know perfectly well what happens to people. You're doing fine in life, and then you get cancer, and then 6 months later you're dead. And all the heroism in the world isn't going to save you at that point. But that's not the point. That's not the point. Life is bounded by mortality. But that doesn't mean that you don't get out there and contend, and you develop by contending, and you minimize the net amount of suffering in the world. And that's something, man. That's something to do. Life is difficult, and you cannot protect your children. What you can do is prepare them, and you can prepare them to be strong and courageous and truthful and resilient and reciprocal in their interactions with other people. And that means you equip them for what life will be, which is at minimum a series of difficult challenges, and often more than that, because of course people go through very difficult times in their lives. And a resilient person is capable of standing up to things in the face of fear and moving forward voluntarily, convinced of their own competence and ability to prevail. And so your primary goal as a parent, apart from facilitating your child's social desirability, which is a major obligation on your part, is to encourage your children and I mean that literally, to instill in them a sense of courage in the face of the difficulties of life, and not to protect them from that. We don't even want to be protected from those difficulties, because a major part of life and its meaning is the challenge that comes with confronting difficulties.
The self is everything you could be across time. So imagine that there's you and there's the potential inside you, whatever that is, And potential is an interesting idea because it represents something that isn't yet real, yet we act like it's real. Because people will say to you, you should live up to your potential. And that potential is partly what you could be if you interacted with the world in a manner that would gain you the most information. Right? Because you build yourself out of the information in the Piagetian sense. But it's deeper than that too, because we know that if you take yourself and you put yourself in a new environment, new genes turn on in your nervous system. They encode for new proteins. And so you're full of biological potential that won't be realized unless you move yourself around in the world into different challenging circumstances, and that'll turn on different circuits. So it's not merely that you're incorporating information from the outside world in the constructivist sense. It's that by exposing yourself to different environments, you put different physiological demands on yourself all the way down to the genetic level, and that manifests new elements of you. And so one of the things that happens to people, and this is a very common cultural notion, is that you should go on a pilgrimage at some point to somewhere central, and that would be, say, like the rock in the Pride Rock in The Lion King, because you take yourself out of your dopey little village, and that's just the little bounded you that everyone knows and that isn't very expanded, and then you go somewhere dark and dangerous to the central place, and while you do that, you have adventures, and they toughen you and pull more out of you, like partly because you're becoming informed, which means information. It means you're becoming more organized at every level of analysis, but there's also more of you too. Look, and you know this, you're useless. You know nothing. You haven't got started. You've got 60 years to put yourself together, and God only knows what you could become. And that message is so much more, it's so funny because it's such an attack, but it's so positive. Because there's faith there in the potential that makes up the person, rather than the miserable actuality that happens to be manifesting itself at the moment. And young people respond extraordinarily well to that, because, and you know that if you're a parent and you love your child, your son, your daughter, what you're trying to foster
is the best in them. You want that to manifest itself across the course of their life. You want them to become continually more than they are, to see what they could be. And I think that's part of the great message of the West, is that that's the ethical requirement of individual being in the proper sense, is to constantly note that you're not what you could be, to take responsibility for that, and to commit yourself, like body and soul, to the attainment of that ideal. You can look at that pessimism that constitutes, let's say, the core of what, I think it's the core religious message, really, is the tragic nature of the world, the reality of suffering. It's part of the core religious message. But what emerges out of that, properly conceptualized, is a remarkable appreciation for what human beings are capable of. Like, we are unbelievably resilient and able creatures, and we do not have any conception of our upper limits. You'll discover a little bit more about your potential as you discover who you are, especially the darker parts of yourself, because then you discover your potential for mayhem. There's some real utility in that. You know, the discovery that you're dangerous, it's such a useful discovery. It's actually something that strengthens you, because the first thing that a realization like that can in fact produce is the ambition to incorporate that danger into a higher order personality, that dangerousness into a higher order personality. And that can make you implacable. That can make you someone who can say no when you need to say no. You know, that can make you someone who won't avoid necessary conflict. And so that's unbelievably useful. When you're moving through life and you have a plan or a dream and it shatters, you know, someone dies or a relationship breaks apart, or you have a terrible upset in your career, or you become ill in some unexpected way, then everything around you falls apart and you plunge into a chaotic underworld.
The belly of the whale.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yes, exactly that. And then maybe you stay there, because it isn't necessarily the case that people get out. You know, people die, people are in despair permanently, but frequently something tragic and terrible befalls you, and you fall apart, and you learn something profound as a consequence, and you put yourself back together, and when you come back out, you're more than you were when you went in. And that's happening at a small scale. Every time you learn something, you know, if you ever really learn something, it's usually painful. It usually means that you have to recognize that you're wrong in some important way. You have to let that part of you that's wrong die, and then you have to let a new part of you. Okay, so the self, imagine that you undergo a series of transformations in your life. There are collapses into the chaotic underworld, and then many resurrections. That happens continually, and that's what molds your character. Assume that the person that you're listening to knows something you don't. Well, they do. The person you're listening to knows some things you don't. You can be sure of that. Now, whether or not you can get to them is a different matter, but if you do get to them, it's a real deal for you. That's why you want to listen to the other person's arguments, is because you're not everything you could be. You don't know the pathway forward with as much clarity as you could. And it's possible. This is one of the wonderful things that I've had the privilege of experiencing as a clinician. You know, because people, it's like I live inside a Dostoevsky novel as a clinician. People come in and they tell me about their lives, and I listen to them, and they tell me things that are just absolutely beyond belief, you know. And I learn from my clients constantly. They're telling me honestly about their experience. They tell me things they wouldn't tell anyone else, because I actually listen to them. But part of the reason I listen is because I'm desperate to listen. It's like, there's a possibility I'm going to do something stupid in the next 5 years that's going to be like fatal. And there's some small possibility that if we have a decent discussion, that you'll tell me something that will eliminate some of my blindness so that I don't have to fall into that particular pit. And if you have a good sensitivity for the depth of the pit, then you know you're pretty bloody motivated to avoid it. And so, and that dialogue is it's dialogic, it's dialogos, right? It's shared logos. It's the way that we redeem ourselves mutually moving forward.